Good evening, folks, and welcome to the Safe Ed for All show, episode 2. And today we're talking all things from the perspective of the school itself. As worried as we are as parents about the spread of COVID in the school environment, there are, of course, many members of staff, adults in that population too, many of whom would share those concerns as we parents have, but also may well be vulnerable themselves. Speaking to us tonight, we have teacher and trade unionist Martin Powell-Davies, 30 years as science teacher, 20 years service as Lewisham National Union of Teachers Secretary, and served for 3 years as London Regional Secretary for the National Education Union. Now Martin is one of 3 candidates standing to be the NEU Deputy General Secretary to be elected in October. Staunch socialist, formerly a member of the Labour Party, now in the Socialist Party. I'm also joined by my Socialist Telly co-host Bonnie Craven, herself a trained teacher, and of course a big welcome back to Safe Ed for All's Sarah Saul and Claire Cosler, former teachers amongst your ranks as well. Welcome one and all. How are we all, folks?
Good.
Yeah, very good. Thanks.
It's the summer holidays, so everything's good. Yeah.
Martin, if I could come to you first, many thanks for joining us tonight. I appreciate that you're a busy man with everything that I've just spelled out, but I hope you're making the most of the summer break as well. I can only imagine how the last year has been for teaching staff. How have you found it and what impact has it had on learning?
Well, as you said, at least it's the holidays and everybody now is taking a break. But, you know, it's been a year like no other. I mean, we're on Socialist Telly, so lots of socialists I know have described the pandemic as the great accelerator. In other words, all the trends that existed in any case, whether it was about inequality, whether it was about global chaos, but everything that we knew about in schools has only, if you like, been exaggerated by the pandemic. So the National Education Union, we always talked about schools being exam factories, about the fact that there was so much pressure on staff and on students. It was results above all else. You didn't speak out, that pressure to succeed. And of course, for students labelled, even as primary school children, as to whether they were successes or failures with SATs, the pandemic has just made that worse. It's exaggerated it. And of course, all that propaganda that's been pouring down on all of us, that schools are safe and we just need to get on with it, I think that's left a lot of conflicted staff and young people. That balance between trying to maintain the curriculum and trying to keep ourselves safe and our families safe. And I think that's taken quite a big toll, actually, on people's stress levels in general and, to be honest, mental health.
Yeah, I'm sure. Staff, parents alike, we're all in a very, very similar boat as far as the stress goes. And of course, as you mentioned, the exam-driven nature of schools these days, it's kind of bitten the government on the backside a little bit in that they've had to put in such drastic mitigation measures, actually, I would say, in that essentially they've awarded GCSEs based on previous work, exams not actually being sat. I'm not necessarily going to sit here and say, well, that's a terrible thing in and of itself. I think I preferred it when things were of a sort of a mixed coursework as well as exam-based sort of approach, rather than the massive exam drive they have now. But it means that there's been that much less to base grading on, I guess. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think as ever, staff will have done everything they can to try and give a fair outcome for students. But of course, results day will be coming up shortly, and then, the pressure will be on some staff. Some students won't necessarily be happy with their results. But I think, the impact on learning, clearly there will have been an impact on learning. But I hope that it's going to be less than otherwise it would have been, because people have been working so hard, both students and staff. But of course, as I was saying before, it exaggerates inequality. So if you were in a home that didn't have IT resources, didn't have a decent space for learning, then obviously you were going to find it harder, particularly when lessons were online, than families who weren't. And I think that is, constantly going to be an impact. And of course, that's why unions, even the government's own advisor, talked about the need to have a recovery curriculum. And I don't know if people remember, it was only a few weeks back. So Kevin Collins, who was the government's own appointed recovery commissioner announced a plan, said it would take perhaps £15 billion to fund, and the government only came up with 10% of that. And so the reality is, they can try as ever to put the blame anywhere but on themselves. No doubt they'll try and put some of it on staff if things don't work out as well as some families might want. But if you're spending, I think it works out. I think Kevin Collins said it would work out about £22 per child in recovery expenditure, when in some countries we're talking about thousands of pounds per head has been spent. I mean, again, the reality is, let's be blunt, this crocodile tears, they don't really care about education. For them, I think it's always been about childcare, just getting kids into school so that they can keep employers happy in terms of then forcing parents, making sure they're in work as well. That's, I think, has been the real agenda over the last year. And parents, students and staff have been, caught at the sharp end of that, trying to make the most out of a situation where the funding's just not been there to really support people.
Yeah, I think changing the rules to guidelines is essentially the blame game coming into effect, isn't it? The government can turn around and say, well, you didn't follow our guidance. It is just blame passing, frankly. Bonnie, I can see you writing a few things down there. What have you got? Do you want to jump in at this moment in time?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, schools have been turned into a massive exam factory. I actually organised a campaign in my children's primary school against the SPAG tests when they were introduced a few years back. But it just goes to show, through this pandemic, I think the term Great Accelerator is a brilliant descriptor, because we have seen kids who have got access to technology and resources and have a parent that's able to be at home with them to support them through this have not got off too badly through all of this. But those kids who are living in cramped accommodation with no internet, no access to a computer or what have you, they've suffered. And then we've also had to see the enormous campaigns by Marcus Rashford to make sure that kids are being fed while they're not at school. I mean, it's utterly wrong that we should have to campaign to make sure children have enough food to eat. That's the bottom line. Kids should never go to bed hungry in the 5th or 6th wealthiest country in the world. Unforgivable. We need to sort out a society where all children have got access to the internet, to good devices, and where parents are actually enabled to take care of their responsibilities. The forced in and out of schools for so many children has been very disruptive. The moral dilemma of should you send your children into school or not during this pandemic has been weighing very heavily on a lot of parents' minds. That's before you get into households where there are vulnerable or extremely clinically extremely vulnerable people there. And we need to make sure all these things are properly addressed as a society. It's laid bare, basically, all the faults in the society as it currently stands. And I was nodding my head along as Martin was talking about school has become a form of glorified childcare. I actually think, I was a teacher for a number of years and I left because of the pressure of SATs on the children that I felt responsible for. I wasn't happy teaching year 6 and putting the children through those exams, which were utterly pointless for the sake of the kids. I would like to see league tables scrapped altogether, so that takes the pressure off the teachers and the children. And we've seen that actually they don't actually serve any function, because when children leave year 6 at primary school and go into secondary school, the secondary schools do their own assessments anyway. They're completely useless. It's just stress, and it's just for the sake of league tables and so on. So we need to remove all of that. And actually, I would like to take this as an opportunity to review the whole of our education provision, because I believe very strongly that what we have now is an education system that was designed for the 19th century world. We are churning out children that can read, write, add up, and that's pretty much it. What we need to do is we need to be developing the citizens for the society that they are going to be living in. We need inquiring minds. We need children to understand a little bit about their social values, about what's important, and to develop curiosities and interests of their own as we go along. We're supposed to enable them. That's our job as teachers, to enable children to see what options they've got before them, in my view.
That's exactly the reason I left
jump in, Claire.
by the way. I was a further education lecturer, and then I was a primary school teacher, and I couldn't do it anymore. And I was being asked to teach out of books. I was being told this page now, and it wasn't me, and I couldn't do that to children. So I left. And as a parent, I think also as a parent who's in that really weird middle ground, we're not rich, but we're not as that poor. But there was one point where there were 3 of us in the house using this laptop at the same time. And I've got the school screaming at me in one ear and my daughter's university screaming at me in the other. And I'm like, I don't have the money to buy another one. This is actually my laptop, you know. And a lot of us were caught in that middle ground where we weren't poor enough to benefit from any initiatives. And then in my case, I'm clinically vulnerable too. There were a whole maelstrom of things. But like you said, I think this is a chance for a massive educational reset. I think this is a chance to really look at the education system and go, what's gone wrong? And I think one of the major things is not actually trusting the teachers.
Or parents, for what it's worth.
Well, the parents, no. I mean, this has been such a feature of this. Don't, you know, when I'm saying it's unsafe for my child to be in school, no, it isn't. I think I know when it's unsafe for my child to be.
Show me the risk assessment that says it's okay.
Written by the head teacher who's arguing with me badly, yes, and reading it going, no, this is not a risk assessment. Yeah, it's been a nightmare, as Sarah will tell you as well.
I've had the same experience. As I've explained before, my youngest asthmatic son was moving from primary school and transitioning to secondary school, so he did not want to miss out on school. The whole start of this for me was, okay, so there are limits to what the school can do. Totally understand. We have a government who will not fund or plan or implement any of the measures that are necessary. However, what can we do? What can we do to work together as a school and a parent of my 2 boys? Okay, let's start with them. I would like them to wear masks, and was point blank met with the guidance says no. You know, it's classic Little Britain. Computer says no. And it didn't matter what I said. And that was all started last August. And then it took, you know, finally get permission for my 2 boys to wear. But then I had to go through another 4 months of a formal complaints process to get the school to allow freedom of choice for all. That's all I ever asked. And those kind of things were set up. Right. The government doesn't help with the guidance. The DfE didn't help with the guidance. But then when you come across, and mine's a multi-academy trust, when you come across that kind of blanket no, when I'm pointing out the guidance doesn't say no, the guidance says it's not advised, it's not recommended. It doesn't say no. And I'm giving you these scientific reports that say this is a sensible thing to do. You can't reduce class sizes. You can't move to blended learning. You're not given an option to remote educate until they fix the measures. You're not improving ventilation. So the one thing I could have some kind of control over as a mitigation was a mask. And that just became a massive issue when it shouldn't really have been. You know, I'm sure the school were absolutely sick of me because they were just like, oh, well, you just go away, woman, most of the time. But equally, I was sick of it. I didn't want to be talking about that. I wanted my boys to be able to go to school with their peers, but not be unnecessarily and knowingly exposed to a virus. I think,
my son had masks removed at the door.
Yeah, because he's primary.
He's in primary and he had masks removed at the door, even though he was perfectly prepared to wear them. You know, and the head teacher just said, no, no. And so, I mean, we're in 2 separate situations. Sarah's sons are still in school. I've ended up withdrawing my son from school, which is not something I would ever have considered doing. I mean, okay, I'm in a position that I'm trained as a teacher. I'm privileged in that, you know, I have a university education. And unlike a lot of mothers in my area, which is quite a poor area, I can. But how many other people? I know there are a lot of children being off-rolled at that school, and I don't think all of them have been voluntary. I really don't. I think they've been pushed into it. My son is SEN. He has an EHCP, but I've still been forced to withdraw him from school because the final straw was referring me to social services, which was really nice on the doorstep, you know. That was,
of course, yeah. It's an absolute outrage that that's happening. But again, it's a little window on the way schools have become these top-down. This is kind of chain of bullying that comes down from the DfE, down through Ofsted. The heads fear for their position, and unfortunately, not enough of them. You know, there are some really good examples of people who are still prepared to work in the in the way that, you know, a genuine head teacher, they've just become school managers and they don't want anyone to speak up, and they basically just pass on government policy. And of course, multi-academy trusts in particular, the most guilty of doing that. But, you know, we've got to find a way, like you have. You know, the thing is, by bringing parents together, and when, as trade unionists, we brought trade unionists together, particularly in January over Section 44, that's what we've got to learn. Because then actually you can turn the tables and say, well, we are going to say no. You say no on your own, it's quite hard, because the basis of trade unionism is you say no together, suddenly you can do something.
And you know, I agree with you completely. But what I think we need as well is for the unions, be it Unite, be it one of the teaching unions, need to have a special division for parents, because parents want to support the staff in the school. Okay, they value the school, they value what their children get from being at school, but they're kind of almost excluded from the decisions that are being made. So really what we need to do is have a formal way of parents unionising and acting collectively to look out for their kids' interests. Because at the end of the day, if a parent's not going to look out for their kids' best interest, who on earth is? And, you know, parents are supportive of education. Of course they are. Of course they are. Seems like a no-brainer to me.
But it also raises the whole question about how schools are run. I mean, obviously, one of the things that academisation has done has made them even less. There's no democratic control. I mean, even a local authority school, often it, you know, remained with councillors who had little connection sometimes, or listened to people. But, you know, I think you've got good pictures of London behind you, Bonnie. I mean, you know, a lot of the schools in London where I spent most of my time are still known as old board schools. So we had elected school boards. I seem to remember this was the kind of thing that Jeremy Corbyn was putting forward, and that's what I think we need, so that you have genuinely democratically accountable local schools with a democratically elected education board. That would have avoided a lot of the trouble that we've had, where parents had a genuine voice, staff had a genuine voice. You know, I think that's again something we need to campaign for. The complete contrast to what academies are doing.
Well, we're now in, as you said at the start, Martin, we're now in the holidays, of course, several weeks now where schools will no longer be driving infection as they have been a facility for. An opportunity for a competent government, you would think, to put measures in place to make schools safer ahead of September. I know, Sarah Saul, you discussed a number of these mitigation measures that could potentially be done during the holidays last week. But what could the government be doing now, in your view, to make schools better prepared to mitigate infection ahead of children returning? And why have such measures not already been introduced?
Well, I think the reason they've not been introduced, as we've already said, is the reality is the government doesn't care. And the last thing it wants to do is to spend money. They've just ballooned public deficit during the pandemic, and they want, obviously, to some extent, to help their mates, and they want us to be paying for it. So they're not spending on money that a government that actually cared about education would. But, you know, as everyone here understands, I know has already been discussed in the previous programme, they're ignoring the risk, they're reversing the mitigations, they've taken away the requirement to wear masks, bubbles, self-isolation of close contacts is going to go. And of course, you know, we always understand that that's been disruptive when bubbles have burst, when self-isolation has occurred, but it has actually had an effect. It has helped limit its infection. So if you're going to take that away, what are you putting in its place? And of course, the issue is ventilation. I thought it was really important on the Independent Sage weekly briefing this week that it was particularly pointed out to what's happening in New York. So you've got a situation in New York where all public classrooms will be equipped with 2 air purifiers. They'll have carbon dioxide monitors to measure carbon dioxide levels. There will be inspected so that if classrooms aren't meeting the safety standards, they won't be used. They're starting vaccinations for some 12 to 17-year-olds, and they'll be retaining masks. So all of those things are being done in another major city. Why aren't they being done here? You know, summer is always the time when schools get those capital works done, make sure that roof is mended or whatever. You know, now would be the perfect time, but nothing's being done. And, you know, if it can be done in New York, why is it not being done in Britain?
Of course.
And as any ex-teacher will tell you, it would improve the general classroom anyway, because the amount of children I've had falling asleep on a Friday afternoon because there's not actually enough oxygen in a classroom where they're sitting there
Yeah.
going like this on their desks would be generally helpful anyway. You know, it would be a really good public work to improve schools in general, with or without a pandemic.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned New York, of course, and the parents in New York can, of course, look up all the details you outlined there, Martin, on a website and see exactly what the state of play is, where their children are being taught, and the classrooms that their children are being in. And yes, it is completely political choice. It's quite clear that it comes down to political choice. When you can spend £37 billion on a test and trace system, which was basically a jolly for the wife of the anti-corruption czar of the government, or 250 million for a royal yacht, but they can't find money to top up the wages of nurses, and they certainly haven't got it for schools. And I think there's a certain element in this that backs up the thinking a lot of people have, that this is all about herd immunity as well, that the government has decided they are not going to seek to try and reduce this virus in the environment. They still think that letting people catch it is going to drive up immunity. And of course, independent SAGE have completely disagreed with that. And the price of these purifiers, you were talking about them last week, Sarah, I think £90, weren't they? The
CO2 monitors for £90 plus VAT, a portable CO2 monitor. So, you know, even if they gave each school one, not ideal because you've got hundreds of classrooms and spaces. However, each school could have had one and could be using it and testing and using the calculation for when classroom density to make sure that that is in place, and they know when to open windows, they know when they need the through draft. And also the HEPA filters, the box filters, $100 they've been made for, you know, and some schools in the States have made them themselves. You know, think outside the box. If the government won't fund, then schools could have raised funds through parents. They ask us for enough money for all other donations for other things. So, you know, this could have been done at the end of the term. We don't want to face this in autumn. It's not coming from the DfE. So can we do something? But the reluctance, I spoke last week about, we've got lots of people in our group who have offered. I've offered to give a CO2 monitor to my school, just the one. Can't take it. It doesn't say it in the guidance, therefore they don't have to use it. We have another member of our group who offered to pay for a HEPA filtration system for one classroom. He would pay the running costs and the installation, and he was told no. And I think the head teacher said to him when he asked, but why? You know, I'm giving it to you for free. Because if I start with that, it's opening a can of worms. What's the next thing you're going to ask for? That's what he faced. And he has two primary age daughters. He just wanted to do something to help. You know, yes, he couldn't afford to do the whole school. However, there's just this reluctance in some areas, some head teachers. And I'm scared of saying this because obviously I'd never ever want to paint a broad brush of, there's so many people involved in education who are so good and are so child focused, child centered with all their decision making as it should be. And yet there are some that are causing, and even today, I've had conversations with someone on Twitter who has accused SafeEd of collaborating with those who are forcing our children back into schools, because we support teachers. We understand you've got jobs, you've got mortgages, you've got homes, you've got families. You know, it's very easy for someone to say, well, teachers should all walk out en masse. It's not that simple. In the same way, it's not that simple where I would prefer not to be sending my children into an unsafe indoor setting. However, my eldest is 15 going into his final year at school. My youngest is 12 going into year 8 now, and they both want to be there. What do? Do I lock them up? You know, all I can do is try to mitigate as much as I can from my point of view as a parent. So all of these discussions about what needs to be in place, what should be in place, we all know what it is, and we all know it's not rocket science, and we all know it could be done. There isn't the political will. And whether that is simply because they're chasing the herd immunity via this hybrid infection and vaccine, which everyone, well, you saw the Citizens Summit. Scientists and advisors from around the world are looking at the UK saying this is madness, this is wrong, this isn't going to work. Or whether it's simply they just want childminding service to carry on. And if we ignore that it's happening, that can carry on, despite the fact, ignore the fact that not all children recover, swiftly, ignore the fact that some go on and have long COVID, ignore the fact that some children are hospitalised unnecessarily. Who wants to see their child hospitalised on a ventilator? Look at the figures for Alderhay Hospital, 50 in the last week placed on ventilation due to COVID. Do you want that for your child? Yes, they might recover fully, but nobody, no parent or a teacher would say they want that happening. It's just the lack, it's a choice that the DfE has made a choice that they are not going to prioritise preventing children and school staff and their families being unnecessarily exposed to this risk of infection. They've made that choice, and we have to.
And this division between parents as well, the division between parents and teachers. We want to work with the teachers. We want our children to be in school, but we're not being allowed to support it.
I think the cases you've outlined there have perfectly exemplified the complexity of reducing everything to guidance, because people will interpret it as best they can for their own individual circumstances. But when, rules are not in place that people have to follow, then of course you have this compromise in your head. You've got to somehow negotiate it with your children rather than say, no, this is how things are. Kids are not daft. The guidance is not, if the guidance is opaque, then they will interpret it to their own, their own way of thinking.
I'd like to point out that there is guidance of how to mitigate risk, which we all agree. Everybody who understands that COVID is airborne understands that there are no mitigations for an airborne virus currently in any of our schools. But there is laws, there's legislation, there's the protection of children, there's health and safety and the workplace. There's so many laws and legislation that if we had money, if parents could litigate the same way they do in the States, there are so many schools right now that would have lawsuit after lawsuit coming at them. But it isn't easy here. It is expensive, and it's finding someone who can take on the DfE or who is willing to take on the DfE to do that for you. Being told that your asthmatic child, even after having permission from the principal, being told by one of the high-vis wearing non-teaching staff who patrol the corridors, get that thing off your face now or I'm giving you a C1, in his second week at secondary school, with him coming home going, I don't want to go back there, I'm not going back there, they shout at me all the time. That's not on. I would have, if I could litigate, if I could have afforded to, they'd have been slapped with a letter before action for that, as they do in the States. But that's not the society we're in. And I'm not saying that's where we want to be. We want to be able to make sure the DfE, that guidance needs to be appropriate for the risk, and all risks should be identified and mitigated to the lowest practicable level. That's what the health and safety legislation is for. And we shouldn't be having to have these conversations over and over again. A school is a workplace, whether it's the teacher's workplace or my boys' complete schoolwork. It's a workplace for them. It's mandatory for them to attend. Therefore, make that indoor environment safe. That's all we're asking for. And I so feel for all the teachers that are having to turn up every day and run that risk prior to any vaccinations as well. Months and months and months, knowing and seeing your colleagues get ill and some of them not return and some of them get long COVID. 580 school staff, I think, at the last count, have already died and won't be here this September because of this. Why aren't more people more passionate and outraged? I feel sometimes that I am the only one.
You're not the only one.
I'm the only one.
You definitely are.
Shouting about this.
Do you know, that's
Just to make a couple of points on that. I mean, one, I've got to say, as a science teacher, I do feel that there are some people who have effectively put science into disrepute, and a real the bravery of some who are prepared to stand up. We know, the scientists that have spoken the truth and have sometimes come against quite a lot of social media attacks for it. But unfortunately, that's always been the way. Science is still part of society, and there are people who seem to want to build their careers by sticking up for a government agenda. When I don't think here we understand what the science of an airborne virus is, but unfortunately that does have an effect, so that not enough staff themselves appreciate always the dangers that are there. And I've got to be honest, a certain, if you like, almost war weariness sort of came in as the year went on. People, working at home when you were trying to do the online learning, sometimes you were also under pressure to do in school and then go home and do online learning and the preparation. It wore people down, and towards the end of the year, people just wanted to be back, wanted to be just in what was perhaps felt like a more normal environment. But it's kind of with crossed fingers, they all hope that come September, everything's going to be okay. And of course, at the moment, case rates are going down, but of course, a good part of that is because schools are closed. And again, Independent Sage, I thought, made that very clearly. The point in Scotland, where the holidays started earlier, then the case rates have much more clearly fallen from an earlier date. And again, it's that correlation that's been clear all along. But, what do you do about it? I mean, that health and safety legislation is absolutely key. And of course, it is what the NEU did in the moment that, all unions have not, to be honest, shown enough fight in the pandemic. And there are times when I felt the NEU itself didn't show enough gumption, if you like. But in January, that was the high point when from the top of the union, we said, right, everybody, we're going to say that schools are unsafe. And we used that health and safety legislation. We said, you as school managers have got a responsibility to provide a safe environment. If there's a serious and imminent danger, which COVID clearly is, then you've got a duty both to the staff that use the workplace and to those communities and students who you support as well. And, that was the moment when suddenly Boris Johnson had to declare that, perhaps schools were vectors for transmission after all. Of course, he forgot that very soon after, but it just shows you, I think trade unionists and trade unions have got a tremendous responsibility, because we're the people who actually, if we use our collective strength, can actually make the biggest difference. So, we did it in January, and I think we've got to learn that we're going to have to do that again. So if we come back in September, at the minute the NEU is saying that the risk assessment advice is still being prepared, so it's not out yet. The previous risk assessment advice that we issued, I felt there was a problem with it because it was too much based on DfE guidance. In other words, it was looking at DfE guidance, say, how do we apply DfE guidance as strictly as possible? But of course, there were holes in the DfE guidance. Now there are so many holes in what the DfE is saying, we're going to have to issue risk assessments that are based on what we want, what we think is safe. The issues of ventilation and small class sizes and mask wearing, that's what we need to put in place in September.
Yeah, I was actually going to come on the next question. I was going to ask you what pressures are the trade unions prepared to bring to bear. I think you've fairly answered quite emphatically there. They haven't really brought much to bear so far. What would you like to see them do if things are not going to shift, particularly between now and the schools resuming, or even after they've resumed?
If I was to be honest with you, I think the problem is at the minute, school staff have just, as the reality is, the stress of a school year is that when it comes to the summer, people just switch off. So I don't think, to be honest, it will be until the end of August when people put their minds back to when they're returning to school, then they'll start to think about it again. But that doesn't mean that work can't be done quite sharply at the beginning of term. Let's see where we are, of course. Obviously, the government just hopes that the situation with vaccination will mean that the problem's gone away. But of course, we understand that those unvaccinated parts of the population, mainly young people and school-aged children, are all going to be mixing. So the rates are going to go up again quite quickly. So, the pressure's got to be there for the risk assessments to be as firm as possible, and for the union to issue advice. If the risk assessments aren't met, then we should be saying that health and safety legislation says that the workplace isn't safe, and then we should be acting accordingly as we did in January. And, the pressure's got to be on there as much as possible for that to happen. And I think from parents' point of view, staff are under pressure. They're under pressure, as we've discussed, from management, just to keep your heads down, just, put children first. Well, of course, we are putting children first, but they mean put your exam classes and exam results, because of my league table position, more first. They don't really mean education in a broader sense first. Putting genuine education and genuine health and welfare first means looking after people's safety and our students' safety. So, I think I would really recommend, I know you've done some of it already, but I think parents groups and yourselves, getting in contact with our local NEU branch and saying, this is what we need. Can we come and speak at your meeting at the beginning of term? Can we explain why we need to work together on this? You will find lots of people who support you. And I think, that's the unity, as we were talking about before, between parents and teachers and support staff, trade unions working together.
I agree. I think some cooperation between parents, teachers, and to not necessarily just to stop any sort of blame game being propagated, because the pressure needs to be on the government to take some action, to use some of this political will, to show some political will that they're willing to actually deal with this in a practical and firm sense. Bonnie, I think you wanted to come in a little bit earlier. I haven't let you come back yet. Do you want to come in a minute?
All right. Yeah. I mean, it's sort of related to what we've been talking about. But the bottom line is, for a multitude of reasons, the number of children that have been off-rolled, either by the parents or by the schools during this pandemic, has gone absolutely through the roof. And I'm really concerned about legislation to hold a register of all of those children. To me, that seems very much like Big Brother. Instead of doing that, and instead of threatening parents of prosecution if they took reasonable measures to ensure the safety of their kids, which actually fundamentally is our number one priority as parents, they could maybe spend a little bit of money on providing interactive online education. If you've got enough money and your child is off roll, you can pay for them to attend a full school online. So there are proper timetables, there are classes, there's a curriculum, there's qualified teachers at the front, there's assessed work and all of that. If the government really put the education of the children first, they could establish a distance learning college like that, making sure that people aren't discriminated against on the basis of their finances, whether they can afford devices and so on. But they could very easily put to use some of the supply teachers or the ex-teachers or the retired teachers, all of those people that have left the profession in droves, could deliver those classes. And it would be fantastic, because there wouldn't be this hokey cokey of kids going in and out, and the mental health distress amongst parents, children and teachers that kids are missing out because of a virus that is spread around the world and is killing people.
I mean, if I can particularly put a word in for supply teachers, because I'm now one myself, as for caring reasons I had to move up here and leave permanent work, and supply teachers have been so frustrated. At best we were furloughed in the pandemic. Lots of supply staff were never even granted furlough and have existed on precious little. And yet there we were at home trying to pay the bills, knowing that all these young people who actually needed our help were there. So, any government that actually cared about education, that was really going to put money into sort of recovery curriculums and supporting people, there's no shortage of trained staff, as you say, those who are existing on supply, or those who have left the work, as others have talked about, because they couldn't stand the way that the exam factory education worked. People are there. The money needs to be there for us to support people.
Those of us who have health issues, who've left because of health issues. If I was teaching online, I could teach online. It was the getting up every morning and trailing 20 miles to do it that didn't really help. And I think there's a lot of teachers in that situation as well. There is a big body of people, like Bonnie said, who they could call upon.
Yeah, I mean, there are, of course, cases around the country of parents choosing to withdraw their children from mainstream schooling over concerns for the safety of their families. And we've got Claire on this call tonight who has done just that herself. But I'm sure there are staff in a similar situation, as Claire has just alluded to herself, or the circumstances they're being required to work under have become too much and they're also leaving. But realistically, what do you foresee the return to school in September looking like?
Well, as I've said, I fear that, the reality is not much is going to have been done. And, you're quite right. The people that puts immediately at risk from a staff point of view, as it was earlier in the pandemic, are all those who are medically at greater risk themselves, or, of course, who live with family members who are at greater risk. And I mean, some good individual work has been done. I know from, you know, some of the local casework we've done in where I am now in Lancashire, that, you know, we've supported individual staff, made sure that a risk assessment was in place that gave them some of the changes they were looking for. But, you know, one of the things that I've been campaigning on is that, you know, we mustn't leave members to fight alone. I mean, trade unions, you know, individual casework is good, but actually I think it's really important that the kind of risk assessments we were talking about talk about, you know, this school is not safe unless it's safe for all of us, so that you're not left in a situation where one individual member of staff is just having to individually negotiate the situation for themselves. I think it's got to be a collective response. It's not safe for any of us. It's particularly, therefore, the impact on this particular member of staff is potentially going to be greater because of their health situation or their family member's health situation. But actually, it's not safe for all of us. You've got to bring in the changes that we all require. And, you know, as we've discussed, they are there. It's clear internationally. People know what changes need putting in place, but it needs demanding that they're there.
Yeah, of course, while these changes have not been put into place, more and more parents are choosing to withdraw their children. There's been a significant rise in the number of children that are being withdrawn from mainstream education. But parents are wanting to take the safe option, I guess, is how you would interpret it, and teach their children themselves at home. What is going to be the ramification of this? I mean, I appreciate we have parents on the call. Claire on the call today, who is herself a trained teacher, who's more than capable of educating her child, more than capable of educating any child, frankly, from a remote perspective. But a lot of parents are not going to be in such a situation. I'm not really sure what the provisions are for teaching children remotely these days. I can only surmise they're certainly not going to be up to the same standard as being able to attend school in the mainstream. If numbers like this continue to rise, what is the ramifications looking like for education in this country as a whole if the government do not start to take this issue seriously?
I mean, I think one thing, though, that we've learned from the pandemic is that actually the remote learning, as others have said, is a possibility. We've got quite good at it. I mean, to be frank, at the beginning, you know, again, like everybody else, it was something that was suddenly thrown at us, and an expectation that we would suddenly know how to do it.
But you know, you were essentially teaching twice in that respect, because you had some children who were at home, and then you had some children who were at school. You were doing double the workload essentially. That's not sustainable. No,
it wasn't, and it completely exhausted people. Yeah. And also using techniques which are quite different. A technique, you know, what you can put across online there. You know, I got to learn techniques. I've been teaching engineering, but, you know, finding videos and online ways of teaching things which you couldn't in a classroom. So, but those techniques have been learned and have been developed. So, you know, they're still there. The danger, of course, I just say in passing, is again sometimes there is a fear that, you know, a part of a government agenda, and this has been seen globally, is actually to privatize this kind of approach, so that it's all sort of privatized online tutoring, making profits for certain online tutoring firms, and actually putting public education lower down the list. So we've got to make sure that it's properly done, available to everybody, and, you know, the funding has got to be there. That's the reality. But the ability to do it exists.
Yeah, I totally agree. I do totally agree with that. But there's got to be a way that you can't have the same people in the schools, such as yourself, teaching children face to face, and then having to do the online stuff as well. I appreciate that it was necessary to start with when the government were looking at this and perhaps started taking it a little bit more seriously at the time when it was first breaking out. But it just seems like they've slacked off completely now. There just doesn't seem to be the will on the part of the government anymore. There certainly isn't the investment being put into this. And if you have supply teachers or former teachers who may well be able to teach from home, then surely there should be funding put in place to allow that to happen, so that, like Safe Ed has been advocating for since their inception, parents have that choice.
Absolutely.
Can I just say, sorry, don't want to butt in,
on,
but
Sarah.
Coming back to something Bonnie said before, you know, the education system, as we know, this is an opportunity to bring it into, modern times. If you ask any child, and I'll speak from my perspective of my boys, obviously, 12 and 15, their brains and the way they soak up knowledge from things they're interested in, whether it's a YouTube clip that then prompts them to watch a documentary on something, that then prompts them to try out some new skateboard technique, or tell me all about Oliver Cromwell the other day. I don't know where that came from. My dad passed away not long ago and he was mad about Oliver Cromwell. My youngest son's called Ollie. Suddenly he wants to know everything about Oliver Cromwell and is talking about making himself the big Lord Protector and fixing this country when he's older. So whoever. But children do learn differently than they used to, and the online learning for some worked so well, and have the legacy benefits of things that could be done to improve our education system. We've said already about mitigation. The legacy benefits of improving ventilation in all schools for everyone will be great. It's not just a COVID measure. It will have a knock-on effect and improve things. And the legacy benefits of learning, when you have children who are long-term sick, some life-limited children that spend an awful lot of time in hospitals and in and out, instead of their education being disrupted so dramatically, if there was an online provision of a similar standard, yes, it's never going to be the same as being in a classroom with their friends. We have the AI bots that I know the Shielders have managed to get into school for the long-term sick children and cancer patients, who have a little AI video screen that is present in the classroom and they interact through that. There's so much technology out there, but it needs exploring and having the ability. If education can't adapt and innovate, what hope is there for any other industry or any other organization? Education should be the one place where we can learn to adapt quickly and protect people better and innovate. Children will adapt far better than adults. We know that, to most things. So it just seems to me a no-brainer that we're not looking at how to, as Bonnie and Martin have both said, change the education system for the better long term. Stop the short-termism. Stop the, oh, you can wear a mask for now, but we'll take it off you in 6 weeks. Stop the, oh, we need some ventilation, but it's not really that important, just open a window. Stop the short-termism. Let's look a bit longer and a bit better. And yeah, the exam system, we all saw exactly as you both said what happened last summer, and is what is likely to happen again. Are we going to have another rogue algorithm somewhere? Things could be so much better, but it's the political will isn't there to do it. And as a socialist, and as Martin said, and as Bonnie said, and as Claire says, if we work together, we can force change. But it's just, how do we get that collective action and collective support going? Because it really sometimes does still feel shouted into the void.
But of course, as a socialist, let's be blunt, that's because we're having a conversation about genuinely wanting education to be invested in for the good of society. And unfortunately, we're dealing with a short-term government that can't see that it's got employment for the future generation and is probably just quite happy. Well, not just probably, it is quite happy to write it off. I've been working in further education. They're ripping up most of the BTECs that I've been teaching, doing away with vocational education. They can, I think that they see it's a waste of money putting funding into education for a generation of young people, most of whom they want to write off. Bluntly, I think that is the position. And we, of course, see it differently, that that's actually the future of society. So, we've got to fight for it.
Yeah, you would have thought the first port of call to opposing this would come from the opposition party. You were formerly a member of said party, Martin. Some of us are still clinging on by their fingernails. What do you make of the opposition's response to this business? Because, well, it's somewhat depressing, we find it, that they seem to be in permanent lockstep with the government instead of challenging them.
Well, earlier on we were talking about, the need for the internet and for IT resources. I seem to remember there was a Labour leader who got laughed at when he talked about
broadband, wasn't it? Yeah,
free broadband for everyone. Now, just think what position that could have left us in. But honestly, you've now got a Labour leadership that seems to his only position to be that you've got to get rid of the mitigations faster. It seems to be more in tune with the big business agenda even than Boris and co. And I think again that I know it's clearly a big discussion about, therefore, where does that give people in terms of political representation? I personally think that the people hanging on to the Labour Party, we need to stop and start again, and that's another job for the trade unions to do. But in the short term, it also means there's even more responsibility on the trade unions, because if there's not going to be an alternative government elected that actually has got an alternative position, then even more trade union action is so important in terms of actually creating a difference.
Yeah, well, members hanging on by their fingernails is one thing. Unions continuing to donate to a party that frankly isn't representing working people, isn't acting in a collective or solidarity manner. That's another question entirely as well, and that's a question they need to be asking themselves, and some seem to be, slowly but surely. We're coming up to the end of our time. There's just one other thing I wanted to ask you, Martin, before we let you go. How's your Latin?
Yeah, I mean, it's really significant, isn't it, that the issues that we've been debating, instead of those being dominating the news, we have this side issue about whether Latin should be taught in schools. I mean, you know, to be fair, I've got some classics educators who would still say that it's something that helps you learn languages more widely, but honestly, it's a sideshow compared to the real issues that we've been discussing. My Latin wouldn't get me too far, I can assure you.
No, I can name a few dinosaurs. That's about the size of mine, I'm afraid. If I was going to learn a language, I suppose I'd attempt to learn my native tongue. I never did flourish with modern language particularly well, but other people.
I did Latin. I am the person. I did Latin at school. It truthfully never got me very far. Except
where's it got you in life, Claire?
Possibly.
Listen, my view is if they want to throw more things into a very narrow curriculum, that's all good.
That's fine.
But we need to make sure that things like critical thought are taught before Latin is taught, in my view.
Teach philosophy, teach critical thought, teach citizenship, teach all of these things. Teach younger people how the political system actually works, because so few of them understand it. Like some of my daughter's friends.
Not just the young people either.
Oh no. Oh, what was it? Oh, I'm trying to. Oh, one of my daughter's friends thought what's it? Corbyn, the actor, was the leader of the Labour Party.
Corbyn Burnson.
No,
Corbyn,
is it James Corbyn?
Corbyn the comedian.
Yeah.
Oh, James Corden.
Yeah. They thought that
Gordon,
she thought he seriously was the leader of the Labour Party. My daughter was just like this, you know. He's been so taken out of schools. I'm old, and when I was at school, we learned how the political system worked. But at a point during the 80s with Thatcher, it was taken out. My brother, who's 9 years younger than me, never learned it. And I think that needs putting back in so that they understand how they fit into the country and how the country works. Because I don't think a lot of them do.
You're
and
right.
I think we've got this generation of 30 and 40-year-olds who don't either.
You're absolutely right there. I mean, what occurred to me when they were criticising the manifesto in 19 for the free broadband was it's a small investment. It's for everyone's benefits. We've seen through the pandemic how much we've relied on everyone having access to technology and the internet. But what also occurred to me is it's about 150 years since the Public Library Act came in place. Now, that required enormous investment in books, in buildings, in staff, in publicity, in all of the setting up of a physical provision. And they were set up, the Public Library Act was about providing resources for education and for cultural purposes too. Now, to my way of thinking, the internet is what we now use in the same way that we used to use public libraries. I can't see why there's any debate about it. Of course we need it. There's no two ways about it.
But although young people aren't taught it, I think experience is always the greatest teacher. You know, I've got a lot of confidence that actually young people will start to draw the right conclusions. Remember last year over the algorithm, it was young people starting to protest over Black Lives Matter. It was young people starting to protest over, you know, Sarah Everard and sexual harassment. It's, you know, young people, I think, it's a confusing situation, but I think young people are learning again that you've got to organise. So, you know, I'm forever optimistic as a socialist that young people will draw the right conclusions, and perhaps some of us older people can help them on the way as well.
I think that's an excellent note to end the show on. Many thanks to all of my guests tonight. Many thanks to Martin for his insights, made for a very interesting discussion tonight. Many thanks to Bonnie, Sarah and Claire for your time and contributions once again this week. Next week, we will be discussing the ramifications for those families who have clinically vulnerable and clinically extremely vulnerable members and the impact on them the spread of COVID through schools has had and looks set to continue to have. So tune in next Tuesday night on Socialist Telly for that. Cheers, folks.